Hello, everyone. Super excited to be here, and thanks for having me today. Is everyone able to see my screen okay at this moment? Perfect. Awesome. So today's presentation is all going to be around HIPAA compliance, and hopefully it's going to be a little bit more specific to some of the SaaS founders that might be on this call today. Um, One of the first things that I wanted to start off with was the spelling of HIPAA. I don't know how many times I've come across HIPAA being misspelled. And so it's not HIPAA with two P's, it's going to be with one P. And honestly, I can't even fault many of the people who misspell it because there were some notable articles that came about, I believe, in the late 1990s, early 2000s that actually spelled HIPAA wrong in those articles themselves. And so they thought that the word privacy was actually part of the HIPAA acronym, but that's not actually the case. HIPAA was founded back in 1996 by President Bill Clinton, and what it stands for is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. So the word privacy isn't in there, but you'll see as HIPAA continues to evolve since its inception, privacy and security are going to become the two main components of HIPAA. Before I get into the rest of the presentation, I wanted to maybe get a base reading from the audience here in terms of how familiar you guys are with HIPAA today. Some of the answers that you can give is not at all, somewhat, or very familiar. And feel free to drop those in the chat, and I can move on to the next. All right, so just a little bit of an intro about myself. Name is David Lee. I'm part of Treasuring here, one of the fractional CPOs. My bread and butter is actually in product management and product design. Those are the two disciplines that I've straddled in my career thus far. When it comes to healthcare, I've got just over 5 years working for different health IT companies. The latest project that I actually completed as part of a venture project was with Ochsner Health, which is the largest hospital network out of Louisiana. We were trying to create a no or zero falls solution for seniors above the age of 65 who are struggling with stability and balance. And then finally, I was also a chief product officer at Wayne Health, was part of building out what we call the smart healthcare platform. And it was essentially a health navigation app that also had access to upfront pricing for the most common procedures in the US. And the database that we built out was comprehensive enough to where we were acquired by our sister company at that time. Awesome. So speaking to the HIPAA timeline, HIPAA was actually originally meant to ensure the portability and the continuity of health insurance for millions of Americans. And the reason why HIPAA came about was because many Americans were starting to feel like they were job locked. So what that means is, as an employee, you are typically going to be on an employer-sponsored health plan. And so they didn't feel like they were able to move jobs because they weren't able to have a gap in their coverage. And so HIPAA came about, and that's what is also what mandates that as an employer, you need to provide access to COBRA coverage in cases when the employee is no longer with you. So again, 1996 is when President Bill Clinton signed HIPAA into law. 6 years later is when HIPAA started to really take its shape with the privacy rule being introduced. And what the privacy rule actually did was it defined what PHI was. PHI stands for Protected Health Information. And you'll see later on in the presentation in terms of how PHI is actually defined, but also how it's a little bit muddy in terms of whether or not you're crossing the boundaries of a HIPAA violation. 2 years after that was when the security rule came about. And the security rule effectively included 3 sets of safeguards that needed to be complied with by both covered entities and business associates. So for those of you guys who are not familiar with what a covered entity is an organization that has direct access to patient records, but also is actually contributing to that patient records. And so we're talking about different hospital networks, clearinghouses that process the claims themselves, the health plans themselves as well. And then when it comes to business associates, we are talking about entities who are managed service providers. Many of you guys might fall under this business associates bucket. And if you're also hired by a covered entity like a health plan or a hospital to fulfill a job then you are essentially deemed as a business associate. So within the security rule, the three safeguards are administrative, physical, and technical. Administrative is going to be covering topics such as risk analysis, workforce clearance, security training, access management, as well as contingency planning. When it comes to the physical safeguards, we're covering topics like physical access to devices that maintain EPHI, standing for Electronic Protected Health Information, device security, some device backups, as well as the secure disposal of data and devices that previously held EPHI. And then finally, the technical safeguard will be covering topics like password management, the automatic logging off from devices, data encryption, audit controls, as well as transmission security. Okay, so a year after the security rule came into place was when the HIPAA breach notification rule came about. And what this rule did is it explained how the US Department of Health and Human Services would now be able to conduct investigations, but not only that, they would also be able to issue civil monetary penalties if a suitable resolution couldn't be achieved by voluntary compliance. And as you can imagine, if you are in breach of HIPAA, it's going to be extremely expensive and it's not cheap. So fines can range anywhere from $100 to $5,000 or $50,000 per violation, with the maximum of 1.5 million per year per occurrence in category. So some of the founders who are in the startup or scale up type of stage, this could be extremely detrimental to your business. So the key here is to be as proactive as possible in terms of mitigating that risk. All right, so 3 years later, after the breach enforcement rule came about, was when the breach notification rule came about. And what this rule did was it mandated that all breaches of PHI be notified to affected individuals and to the Department of Health and Human Services Office for Civil Rights. This was actually coupled with another act called the HITECH 2009. And what HITECH stands for is Health Information Technology for Economic and Clinical Health Act. I know it's a mouthful, but essentially what you need to kind of get out of that was HITECH's primary goal was to incentivize different healthcare providers to start implementing electronic health records. And you'll hear me saying EHRs. And the way they incentivized these healthcare providers to adopt this technology was through the Meaningful Use Program. And the Meaningful Use Program effectively subsidized the cost that was needed to adopt this new piece of technology, going from kind of pen and paper documentation of patient charting now into the electronic interoperable. And then lastly, in 2013 is when the final omnibus rule came about. This rule actually barely introduced any new legislation. What it did, though, was it filled some gaps in the existing HIPAA standards. So for example, it started specifying the encryption standards that needed to be applied in order to render EPHI both unusable, undecipherable, and unreadable in the event of a breach. The primary goal of the final omnibus rule was to make covered entities and business associates more aware of the HIPAA safeguards that they had to adhere to. Okay, one of the other things that I wanted to point out here is when it comes to HIPAA compliance, it's going to be at the business level and not at the software level. What I mean by that is, as a business, it's not a checklist that you can go off, go down the list of checklist items and check it off and say, okay, I am now officially HIPAA compliant. It's a once and done type of thing. That's not the case when it comes to HIPAA. HIPAA, I would say, almost by design, was written to be a little bit vague. And the intention behind that was every organization has different needs and every organization has different ways by which they can be effective in terms of being HIPAA compliant. And so in that sense, HIPAA compliance is going to be measured based on effectiveness. And this also means that each business will have different approaches of being compliant. So if you can imagine a company like Amazon or Whole Foods, who also has a foot in the healthcare industry, the way they go about communication, if there is a breach or what have you, it's going to look a lot different than a smaller company, a size of 5 or 10, right? But in general, there are 7 fundamental elements of what makes an effective compliance program. And the 7 elements are right here. One is implementing written policies, procedures, and standards of conduct. This policy should ultimately be a living document that evolves as your company also grows. And it's not just a set of rules, it's going to become a blueprint for how you handle sensitive health information. Some of the key elements include how PHI is used, disclosed, and protected, how employees are being trained, how breaches are going to be managed. And you can really think about your policy as a narrative that tells how your company lives and breathes HIPAA on a day-to-day basis. So now with the robust policy in place, the focus now needs to shift to implementation. And this is where the policies are being transformed into day-to-day actions. It's going to involve comprehensive employee training, not just as a one-time event, but this is going to be an ongoing program. And it's all about setting up regular audits to ensure compliance, establishing clear lines of communication for reporting issues, and embedding HIPAA considerations into every aspect of your business. So for instance, if you are developing a healthcare app that updates patient records, your policy should absolutely detail how your user data is being encrypted, how it's being stored, who has access to it, and how you will respond in the event of a data breach. All of this policy is all about being specific and actionable. And then number two is designate a person to ensure they're followed. This is all about the sense of ownership, right? Even if you are a healthcare company or a health IT company, unless there is a single person who owns this responsibility, it's going to oftentimes kind of become, something that's in the back of their minds. One of the fun things that my wife did, she was a practice manager at a dental company, and she was the HIPAA compliance officer. And so she would actually, email out to all of the practices and say, hey, as your HIPAA security officer, I'm going to be coming by your office on this month. But she wouldn't let them know which date that she was coming by. And so, this is kind of an internal audit that she was doing. And what she would do is she would have a checklist, list of items that she would go to every practice with, and then basically assess how compliant they were. This is a very good proactive way for you to start identifying those gaps and weaknesses in your current operations, as well as your technology stack. Number three is conducting effective training and education. Again, this is going to be ongoing, and developing effective lines of communication. You also, like I said, want to conduct these internal monitoring and auditing things and enforce standards through these well-publicized disciplinary guidelines. There are so many great resources out there for HIPAA. I would urge every one of you guys to go ahead and do a quick Google search. There's going to be a lot of great resources out there in terms of how you might best implement HIPAA compliance and embed that into your company's DNA. And then finally, if there is a HIPAA breach, you want to make sure that you're responding promptly to these detected offenses and taking corrective action as soon as possible. There are two case studies that I'll be showing towards the end of the presentation, one of which is going to be an example of a company who were a little bit more negligent. And so you'll notice that the penalty amount that they were fined is going to be much higher than another case study that I have as well. Okay, so I know navigating the complexities of HIPAA can be challenging, especially for those who are new to this domain, but at its core, HIPAA really revolves around two fundamental rules. First being the privacy rule, the second one being the security rule. When it comes to the privacy rule, you can look at it as a bastion of patient rights. It's really setting the stage for how PHI can be used and disclosed, and you'll see that PHI and PII identifiers are on this slide. PII stands for personal identifiable information. I want you guys to kind of start imagining PHI as a patient's personal story, and this personal story is being told through their health records. The privacy rule is what ensures that this story is only being shared with consent and necessity. And going back into my point about HIPAA being a little bit vague. So for example, if you look at the name, a bullet point there, if I were to have a company with a database that got breached, and that database only housed full names, right? So you've got David Lee. That wouldn't necessarily be considered PII because there could be many David Lees in the world. But say that now that database has a different data point that has, say, the mailing address. So now you've got David Lee living at, 123 Sesame Street, right? That now in combination is considered PII. So you just want to use, basic logic to make sure that whatever your database has can be separated as much as possible. And if they are combined, then for you to just be aware of every action that you're taking on the database itself. All right, the second core component here is the security rule, and it was really intended to prevent unauthorized disclosure or use of PHI while it's both at rest and in transit. So while the privacy rule can be, looked at as kind of that narrative, right? On the other hand, the security rule is the digital armor that protects that patient's personal story. It's all about implementing robust administrative, physical, and technical safeguards. And for SaaS providers, this means incorporating strong cybersecurity measures, ensuring data integrity, maintaining stringent access controls. And these rules aren't just regulatory hoops to jump through, they're going to be essential protections in a world where data breaches are not just possible, but potentially devastating for the patient as well as the business. So going a little bit deeper into each of these safeguards, we've got the administrative safeguard. When it comes to risk analysis, it's really about conducting regular assessments that identify potential vulnerabilities to the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of ePHI. The reason why this is important is it's going to help you identify the weaknesses in your security posture. This is also going to allow for proactive mitigation and prevention of breaches. Secondly, we've got workforce clearance. This is implementing procedures to screen employees who have access to PHI. Oops, my monitor just went off. Sorry about that. 1 second. Apologies, are y'all still good to hear me now? Okay. Workforce clearance, implementing procedures to screen employees who have access to PHI and ensuring that access is in line with their job responsibilities. The reason why this is important is it's going to minimize the risk of unauthorized access to sensitive information by ensuring only vetted and necessary personnel handle PHI. And then next, we've got security training. This is providing ongoing training on handling PHI securely, understanding HIPAA regulations, and recognizing potential security threats. This is important because it educates employees on compliance requirements and their role in maintaining security and ultimately reducing the risk of accidental breaches. When it comes to access management, this is establishing policies for granting access to PHI based on the employee's role and the procedures for revoking access when that's no longer needed. So when the employee is no longer with the organization, you need to have a set of steps in place to make sure that their access is now fully revoked. This ensures that PHI is going to be only accessible to authorized individuals and on a need-to-know basis. And then finally, we've got contingency planning under administrative safeguards, which is developing and testing emergency response plans, data backup plans, and disaster recovery procedures. Let me see. And this is going to ensure that the business's continuity and the protection of PHI in the event of an emergency or a disaster. All right, going into the technical safeguards, we've got password management, which is implementing strong password policies and regular password changes. I know, when I've done this to my employees, they've had a lot of pushback. Why are you making me change my password every quarter? I promise you that pushback is worth it because it's ultimately going to minimize that risk for you guys. Automatic logging off is another one. Systems need to be configured to log off after a period of inactivity. It's also a good idea to use screen protectors or privacy screens for your laptops and monitors in case you're leaving your workstation. And then you've got data encryption, which is encrypting PHI both at rest and in transit. If you're using a cloud storage provider, you want to make sure that one, they're HIPAA compliant, and then two, that you've got a BAA in place. BAA stands for Business Associates Agreement. And so if you yourself are a business associate and you are outsourcing part of your work to another contractor, that person would be considered a subcontractor, but they also need to abide by HIPAA. And so you need to have a business associates agreement in place between yourself and that subcontractor. And then you've got audit controls, which is using software tools to record and examine activity in systems that handle PHI. There is a group called the Compliancy Group that has a software offering that is exactly around this. And later on, I'll kind of go down into some of the different features of what that software includes. And then finally, you've got the data transmission security, which is implementing secure communication protocols like SSL or TLS for transmitting PHI. And then what this does is ensures that data confidentiality and integrity during transmission over networks is as secure as possible. Right. Lastly, we've got the physical safeguards. This is going to be physical access to devices that hold the PHI. You want to control this physical access to not only the devices, but also the facilities and workstations where PHI is accessible. Data security is using security measures like locking doors or cabinets and using privacy screen filters for monitors. A lot of you guys who have worked at a health IT company before probably noticed that you need a fob to gain entry into the office, but also within the office, you might have different areas or sections of the office that need another fob with a different security layer. Right. So just because you get access to the office doesn't mean that you have access to every part of the office. And then you've got data backups. So securely and regularly backing up PHI, either on-site or with the HIPAA-compliant cloud service provider. So that in the event of a disaster, you've got your data restoration steps in place, and you're also able to verify that the data integrity is still intact post that recovery. And then lastly, the secure disposal of data and devices. This is implementing policies for securely wiping PHI, both from hardware and electronic media before disposal. This is going to prevent potential data breaches by ensuring that sensitive information cannot be recovered from devices that were discarded by the organization. All right, so what actually happens if you were to be found to be breaching HIPAA? It's going to be expensive. The average cost is really around $200 per victim. So for those of you guys who might be on a PMPM type of model, so per member per month, multiply the number of members that you serve by 200, and that's going to be on average what it might cost you because of everything that goes into a breach, right? So these are the 10 different areas that we're going to be covering today. First being breach investigations. This is an external organization that must now come in and investigate the breach to identify the cause and ensure that unauthorized access to PHI has been blocked. The remediation steps, so all of the safeguards that, the physical, technical safeguards that you had implemented now must be either re-implemented or be audited under close scrutiny of the Office for Civil Rights, as well as the general public. And then when a breach does happen, you're gonna ultimately have temporary operational changes. A data breach places considerable amount of administrative burden on healthcare providers, but also health IT companies. When it comes to healthcare providers, the staff must issue notifications, update their website to now tell the public of the fact that there was a data breach, field the customer inquiries that might be coming in. You also need to now manage stakeholder expectations and implement new safeguards. And then you've got the breach notification letters that must be sent out within 60 days of the breach. So this needs to be issued to all affected individuals by first-class post. And subsequent notifications may also need to be sent with updated information. So just to give you guys an idea, for Anthem, Blue Cross Blue Shield, if they were to have a breach, just in postage costs alone, it would cost them $40 million. And so this is one line item out of 10 that we've got here, right? Insane amount of money that you're putting the business at risk. Identity theft protection. This is something that HIPAA requires, right? So if you have a breach, HIPAA requires covered entities to provide free credit monitoring services and identity theft protection services. This is going to cost the organization around $10 per month per individual. The service also needs to be given to the individual for 1 to 2 years. And then if that wasn't enough, you now have to deal with regulatory fines from the Office for Civil Rights and the Attorney General's offices. While the Office of Civil Rights issues financial penalties for HIPAA violations, the Attorney General's office assists the OCR in policing HIPAA and security rules. And let me see. And then what is it? Loss of business and loss of reputation. This is honestly got, like, to me, the biggest downfall of having a breach is that you're now going to have clients, existing clients who don't trust you. You're going to have churn, and you're not going to be able to now acquire new customers either. It's going to be extremely difficult for providers, right, in the healthcare space. The latest stat is that if there is a data breach, providers can now expect a patient churn rate of 5 to 6%, while 65% of the consumers say that they would consider switching providers after a major HIPAA breach. And then say that you get all the way to class action lawsuits. Blue Cross Anthem actually did have one, and had 3 class action lawsuits filed within the first 24 hours after the breach was made known. And class action lawsuits usually claim damages of about $1,000 per victim. And negligence claims may also be filed against healthcare providers for exposing PHI. So this is really serious business here. And then lastly, website needs to be updated to now have that information. You also need a dedicated helpline to now support these victims of the breach. Okay, so with all that being said, who now needs to be HIPAA compliant? The general rule of thumb here is that if you work in healthcare in any capacity, you need to be HIPAA compliant. And as stated earlier, there are 2 different types of organizations. The first one being covered entities. And this is, again, entities that are involved in the direct creation of PHI. And then business associates, again, is one that's hired by a covered entity. So many of you guys might actually fall under the MSP bucket. But EHR providers, medical billing services, cloud storage providers, attorneys, all the way down to shredding service providers is going to fall under the business associates category. So as a SaaS company in the healthcare space, understanding your role under HIPAA is crucial. And typically SaaS providers, again, are going to fall under the BA category. But this designation is crucial because it's not just merely about the legal compliance, but about being the trusted custodian of health data. Okay, so if you have looked into HIPAA, you might have probably also come across what's called SOC-2. And while HIPAA compliance is a federally regulated law, SOC-2 compliance is a voluntary security framework, especially for cloud-based products. And while it's going to be optional for you to be compliant with SOC-2, potential clients will often consider SOC-2 compliance as a minimum security requirement when choosing a SaaS provider. So I don't know how many times I've looked at different SaaS companies, especially when I was at Point Health and another health IT company, but I couldn't go forward with that contract because they didn't have that SOC 2 compliance. And so it's really, really good if you're able to have both and you're also able to showcase both on your website. SOC 2, it requires SaaS providers to follow strict security policies and procedures that relate to the integrity, the confidentiality, and the availability of data stored in the cloud. And this is going to closely mirror HIPAA security rule. And so here in the slide, we've got SOC 2 and HIPAA columns. And so if you ask yourself, so are you a cloud-based service organization that stores or processes sensitive customer data? If so, you might want to look into becoming SOC 2 compliant. And if you want a competitive advantage against other players in the market, it's probably wise to get your SOC 2 compliance in place as well. And then the same thing applies for HIPAA on the right side. So what are some of the benefits of doubling up? One, it's proactive and cost-effective when compared to you having a breach, right? So as we saw earlier, HIPAA violations and data breaches can lead to significant losses, not only to the business's finances, but most importantly, the business's reputation. So by being HIPAA compliant, businesses can reduce penalties and the possibility of lawsuits. And then secondly, it increases customer trust. No client will be comfortable going into a business with an entity they don't trust. HIPAA and SOC 2 compliance is going to be that proof in the pudding that security is embedded in your business's DNA. And then lastly, as stated earlier, you're going to get that competitive advantage. You're going to want this to be as upfront as possible, probably in your website footer, especially if you're within this health IT space. Okay, so going into our first case study, the first case study is around a teledermatology platform called Miiskin. Miiskin is based in Denmark, but they actually serve about 150,000 patients here in the US. And while Miiskin, because they're based in Denmark, they were already GDPR compliant. GDPR, for those of you guys don't know, is General Data Protection Regulation. And you might have also heard of CCPA, which is the California Consumer Privacy Act. Those two are in place to make sure that data is handled in a secure and private manner. And for Miiskin, because they had US patients, they needed to be HIPAA compliant. And this is a great example of an organization who's being as proactive as possible when it comes to becoming HIPAA compliant. And so what they did was they actually reached out to Compliancy Group. Compliancy Group is an industry leader in HIPAA compliance software. And by working with Compliancy Group, they were able to achieve HIPAA compliance by attending 3 meetings with their compliance coach over a 5-week period. So going into Miiskin a little bit and kind of illustrating how proactive they were. Miiskin actually has a very limited number of devices that can potentially access PHI, with only 1 employee in their entire organization who even has the potential to view PHI. However, they decided to train all of their staff so that they can instill a culture of compliance within their entire organization. This is something, that is a great example of someone who's taking this seriously. And then Compliancy Group, as mentioned earlier, has a compliance tracking software called the Guard. The Guard is going to include audits around security risk assessments, gap identification, as well as remediation. It's going to list out the HIPAA policies and procedures, provide you with content around employee awareness training. This is, again, ongoing. I know it's a doozy, but it's a good reminder for many of us who need to take it on a yearly basis. It's also going to give you that kind of boilerplate business associates agreement that you can then share out with your contractors as well. It's going to help with the incident reporting and breach support. And then finally, the nice thing that you get is the seal of compliance that you see on the slide. Because HIPAA, as a federally regulated law, doesn't have a badge per se, this is one roundabout way by getting one through the Compliancy Group and also being able to position yourself as someone who is definitely on top of things. All right, conversely, we've got Montefiore. Montefiore is a nonprofit hospital system based in New York City. And in 2015, one of Montefiore's employees had unlawfully accessed the medical records of just over 12,000 patients. They then copied that information and then proceeded to sell that data to identity thieves. And then 9 years later, just this month, is when Montefiore has agreed to settle the investigation by paying a $4.75 million penalty. This is huge, right? And so similar to Montefiore, there was another investigation that happened for a company called Excelis Health Plan. And their breach actually affected 9.35 million individuals. But their fine was just at 5.1 million when compared to the 4.75 million that Montefiore had, when they only affected just over 12,000 patients, not even in the millions, right? So why is there such a difference? So while the scale of the data breach is taken into consideration by OCR when determining the appropriate penalty, it's really the nature of the underlying HIPAA violation that has the biggest impact on the size of the penalty. For Montefiore's case, their negligence was deemed to be severe, which is why their fine reflected that amount. Okay, so I know we covered a lot today, so I wanted to highlight some of the key takeaways from today's workshop. One, understanding and implementing HIPAA is not just a legal requirement. It's going to be a foundation for building trust with your clients. 2, developing robust HIPAA policies and procedures tailored to your specific operations is crucial. Again, HIPAA compliance is going to be measured based on effectiveness. And then 3, regular penetration testing and audits are essential for proactive risk management. You're going to want to identify those gaps as early as possible and as regularly as possible, and then be able to fill those gaps as quickly as possible. And then staying informed and adaptable to changes in regulations and technology is key to maintaining effective compliance. So going back to that sense of ownership, you want that one person at your organization to own this responsibility of staying up to date, staying abreast of what's happening in this space, and then making sure that they are also informing the right constituents in the organization to make those needed changes. And then finally, embedding a culture of compliance within your organization is going to be vital for both your long-term success and growth in the technology sector. Okay, we've got some action items for y'all as well. So one, conduct a thorough risk assessment of your current operations. The next slide after this, I'm going to have a couple of QR codes. The first one is going to be a compliance checklist. That's going to be at the general level. And then the second one is going to be for SaaS providers specifically. You can use those checklists to kind of start tackling number one here. Two, begin developing and refining your HIPAA compliance plan. I can't stress this enough, but there are different companies that I've been with where we've got a HIPAA compliance officer, and that person is kind of the go-to person when we have questions about HIPAA, but that person has everything in their heads, right? They haven't documented it. And that, in effect, is not making that company HIPAA compliant. You want to have all of this be documented and be as detailed and actionable as possible. Schedule periodic audits and reviews of your compliance practices. This one, I would encourage you guys to do it at least once a year. If you can do it more frequently, that is all the better. And then finally, proactive engage with legal and compliance experts to stay ahead of the curve. Okay, so I know let me see, here is the compliance checklist. I'll leave the slide up for the next 15 seconds or so. Alternatively, you can also email Chinoa at cs@trustshoring.com with the subject HIPAA, and we're more than happy to share out the slide deck with you. All right, hopefully everyone's had a chance to scan the QR code. Next, I wanted to cover a little bit about what we do here at Trust Shoring. Again, I'm one of the fractional CPOs here, and there are about 4 or 5 different ways that we can help you guys. One being HIPAA compliance, right? We can help with analyzing your requirements, creating this compliance program that's going to be unique for your business, and then reflecting that in your roadmap, overseeing the implementation of it itself. And as a nice to have, if you want that SOC 2 compliance, we can also assist with that. If you need help with technical leadership, we're here for you as well. I'm one of the fractional CPOs, but we also have fractional CTOs who have the ability to review your code and architecture, plan and advise on technical decisions, set up proper development processes, consult on scalability, as well as helping out with vetting developers or different agencies that you might already be having conversations with. And then, like myself, if you need product leadership around business goal setting, road mapping, or prioritization, this is kind of my bread and butter, is setting up that product management process, whether it be based on Scrum, Kanban, Lean Startup, you name it. And then we can effectively be that in-house coach. And then finally, we've got, we got one more after this. We've got pre-vetted developers across any geography, any seniority, any tech stack, and you can hire them flexible on an hourly basis. And we can also headhunt for your team as well. But if you need something a little bit more robust, like an entire software house, we have that as well. Again, geography agnostic, tech stack agnostic, and we have a network of trusted boutique firms at right around 100 people that we've worked with in the past. And I think the main value here is that there's already existing synergy amongst this team on how to work best with one another. Okay, and here is the slide for Chinoa. Again, you can request the slides by emailing us here. And then finally, I wanted to show you guys a YouTube channel, our YouTube channel at Trust Shoring. We are pushing out content on a weekly basis with actual advice for technical and non-technical founders. So I urge you guys to go ahead and follow us and subscribe on YouTube there too.
Just want to say thank you so much for today's talk, and also thank you so much to Victor and Chinoa. You guys have been such an awesome support team, so thank you so much.